Keanu Reeves is about to take a risk that could change everything. Disguised as a homeless man, he's testing the police. No cameras, no backup, just raw truth. What happens when one of the world's most famous faces becomes invisible to the very system meant to protect? Watch closely, because this moment will leave you questioning everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Keanu Reeves stood in his downtown Los Angeles apartment, staring out at the early morning hustle. The city was waking up, people moving quickly, unaware of the invisible lives around them. His mind, however, wasn't on the ordinary morning scenes unfolding before him. He had been disturbed by the recent stories he'd seen. Homelessness, abuse, veterans discarded by society, treated as less than human. Each video, each news story weighed heavily on him, but it was one that stuck with him the most: a homeless veteran being cuffed for nothing more than trying to sleep in peace. That had been the tipping point. He had to do something. Keanu was no stranger to standing up for what's right, but this felt different. His fame, his wealth, they had always been tools for good, but how much had he really seen? He knew he had lived a life far removed from the struggles others faced. He wasn't sure how he could change things, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He had to understand what it was like, to truly feel it. The idea hit him suddenly. A test. Not a stunt for attention, but a true experiment. To disappear. To become invisible. Just like the thousands of homeless people who walk unnoticed in the very streets he passed every day. Keanu wanted to experience it, to walk the streets as one of them, to see what it felt like when you were treated as nothing more than a shadow, to feel the powerlessness, the fear, and the deep, crushing invisibility. His decision was made. He didn't need to talk to anyone about it. It was something he had to do alone. The whole world could watch later, but for now, he would step into their shoes. Keanu began to prepare for what he knew would be a jarring transformation. He walked to the mirror, taking a deep breath. It wasn't just about changing his appearance. It was about changing how he saw the world. It was about shedding everything he had come to represent and becoming just another face in the crowd. He grew his beard, letting it become unkempt. He replaced his clothes with layers of worn, mismatched garments he had bought from a thrift store. His face, usually clean and polished, now bore the dirt and grime of someone whose life had been stolen by circumstances beyond their control. Keanu stood in front of the mirror, the reflection before him almost unrecognizable. The clean-cut man known for his humble nature now seemed a stranger. His eyes met his own gaze, a man determined yet burdened with a weight he hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't just about the disguise. This was a mental transformation, an emotional dive into a world that was hard to comprehend unless you lived it. He had heard the stories, seen the viral videos, and listened to the countless experiences shared by people he met during charity events. But this was different. His hands moved automatically as he added the final touches. Dirt streaked along his cheekbones, his hair left unkempt. He had changed, both inside and out. The street clothes were a far cry from the tailored suits he wore in front of cameras, and the dirt on his skin only made him feel further removed from the world he was used to. He looked like someone society had already discarded, someone who didn't matter. For a moment, Keanu paused and let the weight of the decision sink in. He would be invisible, just like so many others. No cameras, no fans, no team ready to jump in if something went wrong. He would experience what it meant to live without dignity, without visibility. The privilege of being seen would be gone. For a man who had spent most of his life in the public eye, this was a daunting shift. But it felt necessary. Keanu gathered his bag, packed with only the essentials. He had planned for this to be a simple, self-contained test. He didn't want recognition, and he didn't want help from anyone. He needed to experience this firsthand. The streets would be his classroom. The officers patrolling the area would be the unwitting subjects of his quiet challenge. As he stepped outside, the city felt different beneath his feet. The familiar streets of Los Angeles were now alien to him. He was no longer the Keanu Reeves people recognized. He was just a homeless man walking through the world unnoticed. This was the real world, one where everything, from the way people looked at him to the way he was treated, would be different. And that, he knew, was exactly the point. As Keanu walked through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, he couldn't shake the strange feeling of detachment. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and endless streams of people, now seemed cold and indifferent, almost as if it had forgotten him entirely. He had walked these streets countless times before, but now he felt like an intruder. No one looked at him twice. No one noticed the man beneath the layers of ragged clothing and dirt. He passed a group of people who were so wrapped up in their own conversations, their phones, and their busy lives that none of them even glanced in his direction. Keanu found it strange how invisible he was. It was as if he had entered another world, one where he didn't matter, didn't exist. He could feel the subtle change in the way people moved around him. They avoided eye contact, deliberately giving him space, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. He had become part of the background, just another anonymous figure in a sea of forgotten people. Keanu continued walking, his destination unclear. He was drawn to the areas where the homeless had set up their makeshift shelters. He didn't need to seek them out, he could feel their presence, the subtle energy that filled the air. He knew this part of the city well, but it felt different now. This wasn't the glamorous part of town, where the lights shone bright and the celebrities roamed. This was the underbelly, the hidden world that no one cared to see. It was here that Keanu would test his theory that people, when stripped of their status, become faceless. Here, he would see how society treated those who lived on the margins. Keanu's steps led him to an area near a bus stop where a small group of homeless people had gathered. They were huddled together in the shade, some sitting on old cardboard boxes, others wrapped in blankets. Keanu slowed as he approached, noticing the looks of wariness in their eyes as they regarded him. He didn't blame them. To them, he was just another man who might ignore their plight, just another passerby. For a moment, Keanu paused and watched them. He could see the pain in their eyes, the exhaustion of lives lived in survival mode. These people were survivors, each with their own story, their own battles. They weren't invisible because they didn't exist. They were invisible because the world chose not to see them. The weight of that realization hit Keanu hard. He knew this experiment wouldn't be easy, and it wasn't supposed to be. It was about witnessing the truth, about understanding what it really meant to be treated like a non-person, to be something that people looked through rather than looked at. This wasn't a stunt. It was a journey, a painful, necessary journey. Keanu walked further into the quieter parts of downtown Los Angeles. The city's energy felt distant, muffled. The sounds of honking cars and busy people seemed far away now, replaced by the quiet rhythm of his own steps. His body was moving forward, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in the shift from one world to another. He reached a secluded part of the city where the noise of the streets began to fade. It was here, amid the cracked pavement and forgotten corners of downtown, that Keanu paused. The city was filled with its own secrets, its own forgotten corners, and here he was, about to discover one of its hardest truths. Standing in front of a storefront, Keanu looked into the glass window. What stared back at him wasn't Keanu Reeves, the actor, the philanthropist. No, this was Charlie, a man who had lost everything, a person no one would look twice at, a face that wouldn't be remembered. His sharp features, usually so familiar, were now buried beneath the dirt and grime he had applied deliberately. His hair, once neat and styled, hung in disarray. His clothes, tattered and mismatched, made him blend into the background of the city, just another person no one would take the time to notice. Keanu stared at the reflection. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. The man in the mirror had been reduced to something far different than he had ever imagined. He looked like someone who had been discarded, someone who had become invisible to the world. The transformation wasn't just physical. As he looked at the man in the reflection, Keanu realized he had removed every trace of his usual persona, the celebrity, the man people recognized. What he saw now was someone stripped of every external layer of privilege. He felt the weight of that privilege, heavy in a way that made his chest tighten. To be seen as who you were, to be treated based on your status, had been something he never fully understood until now. This wasn't a stunt. This wasn't for publicity. He wasn't doing this for fame or attention. It was for something deeper. Keanu had made this decision to understand, to experience firsthand what it was like to be nothing more than an invisible man in a city that passed by without a second thought. Standing there, Keanu knew that this experiment would be harder than he had ever imagined. The decision wasn't just about walking in someone else's shoes. It was about feeling the weight of being unnoticed, of being someone whose struggles were ignored. The emotional toll of this transformation was already beginning to sink in, but there was no turning back. Keanu's feet moved almost on their own as he continued walking through the city. The stark contrast between how he was treated now versus the attention he usually received was jarring. People moved around him without a glance, stepping past him as if he didn't exist. His own mind raced, processing the raw reality he was now facing. He had spent years living under the glare of the spotlight, always being seen, always being acknowledged, but now he was nothing. To the world around him, he wasn't Keanu Reeves. He was just another homeless man on the street. He could hear the sound of footsteps approaching behind him, but he didn't turn around. They passed by without a second thought. There was no curiosity, no recognition, just the absence of acknowledgement. It was exactly what he had hoped for. And yet, the reality of it felt strange, uncomfortable, and surreal. He had never been invisible before. He had never known what it felt like to be ignored, overlooked, to simply be part of the background noise of a busy city. Keanu kept walking, his body moving automatically as he adjusted to his new, unremarkable presence. He passed by a small park where a couple of homeless individuals were gathered, sitting on benches or standing around. They barely looked up at him, lost in their own lives, as if they too were accustomed to the world ignoring them. He couldn't help but wonder if they recognized him. Did they know he was different? Or had they grown so used to being overlooked that even someone as famous as Keanu Reeves could fade into the background? As Keanu walked further, he noticed how quickly he blended into the crowd. He wasn't seen as a person. He was just another discarded soul who no one cared to help. His body felt heavier with every step, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of invisibility. How long had this been going on? How long had people been suffering in silence, their dignity stripped away because they were seen as less than others? The reality of his experiment settled into his bones. This wasn't just about wearing a disguise. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about experiencing the emotional and psychological toll of being unseen, unheard, and unloved. The small moments, the way people avoided eye contact, the way a woman clutched her purse as she passed him, the way the police patrols ignored him, were the signs he was looking for. These were the moments that defined the lives of the people he was trying to understand. Keanu paused in front of a small cafe. He didn't go inside, just stood outside, watching people enjoy their morning coffee, their conversations, their lives. He was on the outside now, and it felt like a foreign world, one he had never been a part of. His mind flickered back to the life he had left behind. His movies, his fame, his fortune. But all of that now seemed so distant, so irrelevant. What was the point of it all when people who were just like him, just as human, were forced to live like this every single day? Keanu continued walking, his steps slower now as the weight of the situation settled deeper within him. The world seemed to move around him as though he were a ghost, people passing by, heads down, eyes straight ahead, avoiding him without a second glance. He had always been in control of his presence, able to command attention when he wanted it. But here, on the streets, in this new reality, his presence was irrelevant. He wasn't seen, he wasn't even noticed. As he passed another street corner, he watched a woman clutch her purse a little tighter as she walked past him. He saw the flash of fear in her eyes, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was one of the many who blended into the background. Someone who didn't matter. It hit him hard, that subtle shift. He wasn't just ignored, he was feared. He was invisible, but at the same time, his very presence made people uncomfortable. He rounded a corner and found himself in front of a small group of homeless people sitting on the sidewalk. They were sitting in silence, a few of them with their heads down, others staring off into the distance. He paused, standing on the edge of their world, unsure of how to enter. He didn't belong here. He wasn't one of them. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't Keanu Reeves, the actor, the public figure. He was just another man in need of a place to rest. Another face that would go unnoticed. One of the men looked up at him, his eyes calculating, studying him for a moment. Keanu's gaze met his, and there was something unspoken in that brief exchange. It wasn't an acknowledgement of recognition. It was simply the silent acknowledgement that they were both outsiders here. The man didn't look away, but Keanu could feel the unspoken question in his eyes. Who are you really? But Keanu didn't have an answer. He didn't know who he was now, standing on the streets, lost in the crowd. He had removed every trace of his identity, yet it felt like he had lost something much deeper. It wasn't just his fame or status. It was the essence of how he was seen. This was real. This was a side of life he had never experienced, and it was humbling in a way he couldn't have predicted. The sun was rising higher now, and the streets began to fill with people. But Keanu didn't feel part of it anymore. He was a ghost among the living, blending into the background, invisible and forgotten. And as he continued down the sidewalk, he couldn't help but think about the lives of those who had been here long before him, and how many others were living this same existence without anyone ever truly seeing them. It was overwhelming, this feeling of being stripped of everything he had once taken for granted. But it was also awakening. Keanu didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, he felt the rawness of what it meant to be invisible, to be nothing more than a face in the crowd. Keanu settled into a quiet corner of downtown Los Angeles, finding a small concrete planter to sit on. It was a busy area, one where the world rushed by, people on their phones, drivers honking their horns, business meetings happening in full swing. But here, amidst all the movement, Keanu noticed something different. The homeless were present, sitting quietly in corners, barely noticed by the people rushing past. He took a deep breath, trying to settle into the role he had chosen for the day. He had removed all traces of his identity, his fame. He was just another person on the street, just another face. Not far from where he sat, a man caught his attention. The older man was painting on a small canvas, creating an urban street scene with surprising skill. His clothes were worn, and he had a weathered face, but there was something commanding about him. Keanu could tell this wasn't his first time painting on the street. Keanu, curious, leaned closer, offering a nod of approval. "Nice work," he said, trying to sound genuine. The artist paused for a moment, then looked up. "Thanks," he said, his voice a little gruff. "You like the city?" "Huh?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, it's fascinating, the way it all moves." The artist didn't speak for a moment, his brush still in his hand, as though weighing something. Finally, he spoke again. "You're new here, huh?" he asked, eyeing Keanu with a sharp look. Keanu hesitated, then replied, "First day." "Ah," the man said with a knowing look. "You'll learn the ropes." He paused, adding, "Name's Carlos. Most folks call me Sketch." Keanu introduced himself, and the two settled into a quiet conversation. Carlos was careful but not unkind, sharing bits and pieces of his life. He explained how he had been on the streets for years, painting to survive, living from corner to corner. Then Carlos warned him, "The cops come around here a lot. Some are fine, but there's one you need to watch out for, Officer Voss. He's aggressive, doesn't care about the rules, just wants to make us disappear." Keanu listened, absorbing the weight of Carlos's words. This wasn't just about survival. It was about a constant battle with those who were supposed to protect, yet often persecuted. Carlos continued to work, his brush strokes precise and deliberate as he painted a street scene that captured the life around him. A life most people ignored. The city was full of contrast. Shiny glass buildings towering over cracked sidewalks, the bustling rush of pedestrians passing by without a second glance at the individuals who sat quietly on the edges of the streets. Keanu watched him, silently listening to the hum of the city. The words from Carlos echoed in his mind, especially about Officer Voss. It was clear this wasn't just about the art, it was about survival. Every day was a struggle for respect, for dignity, for recognition as a person rather than an object to be moved out of the way. Keanu understood that now more than ever. He took a moment to ask, "How do you manage it, every day, with all of this moite, being looked through?" Carlos set his brush down and sighed, leaning back against the planter. "You learn not to care, in a way," he said, "but then, in another way, it's all you think about. You start to wonder if you're even really alive, if anyone would even notice if you weren't here anymore." Keanu's chest tightened at the raw honesty in Carlos's words. He had heard stories of the hardships the homeless faced, but hearing it firsthand from someone who had lived it for years was a different kind of truth. It wasn't just about surviving on the streets. It was about the constant erosion of your sense of self-worth, the quiet despair of being invisible in a world that never stopped moving. Carlos continued, his voice quiet but firm. "The hardest part isn't the cold or the hunger. It's the loneliness and the way people look at you like you're nothing. They don't see you as human anymore." Keanu sat in silence, his mind racing. He had known there was a divide between the privileged and the marginalized, but to feel it so viscerally was a different kind of realization. "Yes," Keanu said, and Billy was pleased he was on. "Does it get easier?" Keanu asked. Carlos shook his head. "It never gets easier, but you get used to it, or at least you learn how to hide it. You learn to keep your head down, your distance from everyone. That's the only way you survive. Because if you don't, if you let people see you, they'll treat you like garbage." Keanu's heart sank. It was a harsh reality, one that spoke volumes about the way the world viewed people like Carlos. He didn't want to imagine what it must have been like for someone to lose everything, to fall through the cracks and never be seen again. "How do you keep going?" Keanu asked, genuinely curious. Carlos looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You have to keep moving. You can't stop. If you do, you're done. The streets will chew you up. It's not just the police or the people who ignore you. It's the feeling that you've been forgotten by the world. That's the hardest part. But we keep going, day by day." Keanu sat there for a while, absorbing the weight of Carlos's words. There was so much more to this life, this world of the invisible, than he had ever realized. The more he listened, the more he understood just how deep the divide went. It wasn't just about money or fame. It was about how people saw each other. And for many of the homeless, they weren't even seen. They were nothing more than obstacles to be cleared out of the way. The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the pavement as more people moved past. The buzz of the city continued, but Keanu's attention remained on Carlos. The street had become a blur as the hustle and bustle of everyday life seemed distant. People hurried by, heads down, avoiding eye contact with the homeless. Those who were, for all intents and purposes, invisible. It was strange, seeing it from this side. Keanu had always been a part of the world that was seen, but now, sitting next to Carlos, he understood how easily one could be overlooked. Carlos, completely at ease, continued to paint. His brush moved with purpose, capturing the vibrant yet harsh reality of the city. Each stroke seemed to breathe life into the canvas, transforming the street into something beautiful, something real. Keanu marveled at the quiet power of Carlos's art. It was his voice, his defiance against the world, that had pushed him to the edges. "You're good," Keanu said, breaking the silence. "You should be seen." Carlos glanced up from his work, offering a faint smile. "That's the problem. No one looks. They walk past, thinking we don't matter." Keanu could feel the weight of those words. To be seen. It was more than just being noticed. It was being acknowledged, respected. It was the difference between existing and thriving. Carlos had no illusions about the world he lived in. He had long ago accepted that his existence didn't fit into society's picture of success or importance. As they sat in silence, Keanu noticed two officers approaching. One of them, a man with a rigid posture, walked directly toward them. Officer Voss. Keanu had heard about him. Aggressive, known for targeting the homeless. His presence sent a chill down Keanu's spine. Carlos didn't react immediately. He simply continued his work, as if he'd seen this happen countless times before. Keanu followed the officer's gaze as it swept over them, the disapproval clear in his eyes. "You need to move. This area's restricted," Voss said curtly, eyeing Carlos's artwork. Carlos remained calm, his voice steady. "I've got a permit. I'm allowed to be here." Keanu saw the tension building in Carlos, a quiet strength masking the frustration of someone who had dealt with this every day. He wondered how many times Carlos had faced this kind of aggression. The city around Keanu continued with its usual pace. People rushed by without a second glance, walking through their lives as if the homeless didn't exist. Keanu, still in his disguise, felt the weight of invisibility press down on him. He was no longer Keanu Reeves, the actor. Now he was just another face in the crowd, unseen and unnoticed. His thoughts were interrupted when two police officers walked into his line of sight, their presence cutting through the hum of the street. Keanu instinctively tensed. One of the officers was Officer Voss, a man whose reputation had preceded him. He exuded arrogance, walking with a purposeful stride, eyes scanning the area as if to claim ownership of it. His very posture broadcasted a sense of control. Next to him, Officer Lee walked with a calm that stood in stark contrast to Voss's aggressive energy. Lee moved smoothly through the crowd, eyes alert but not threatening. She didn't seem to be looking for confrontation. She seemed to be observing, processing the scene around her. As the officers approached, Keanu's focus shifted to Carlos, who sat nearby, continuing his painting. The older man didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as if he had seen this before, the tense interaction between homeless individuals and the police. Keanu watched closely, sensing the underlying tension. Officer Voss was the first to speak, his tone sharp and dismissive. "What's this?" he barked, pointing at Carlos's artwork. "You know the rules. You can't just set up here like this. Move along." Carlos didn't react with panic. Instead, he stood slowly, his eyes meeting Voss's. "I'm allowed to be here," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I've got the proper permits." Keanu could feel the weight of the exchange. Officer Voss didn't care about the permits. He wasn't interested in hearing Carlos's side. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing as if trying to force Carlos into submission. "I don't care about your permits," Voss insisted, his tone rising. "Just pack up and leave." As Voss continued to press, Officer Lee spoke up, her voice much softer. "Jake, "This isn't necessary," she said, trying to diffuse the tension. Carlos, his composure still intact, looked calmly at Officer Lee before returning his gaze to Officer Voss. Keanu could see the subtle shift in Carlos's demeanor. He had been through this many times before. The harsh treatment, the intimidation, the way people with power often treated the homeless like they were invisible, like they didn't matter. But Carlos wasn't backing down. He simply stood there, his face set in quiet defiance, like a man who had learned the value of persistence. Keanu felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could feel the tension building, the way Voss was pushing. There was no doubt in Keanu's mind that Officer Voss was used to having his way, used to intimidating those who had no power to stand up to him. Voss was quick to take control of the situation, acting like he was above it all, like he was the one who determined who deserved respect and who didn't. There was the one who told him, "Don't raise your hand, because someone is going to rat me out. And if you do, it'll mean that..." But it wasn't just about control, Keanu realized. It was about intimidation. Voss didn't want just compliance. He wanted to make an example out of Carlos, to show him who was in charge. His posture, his words, his very presence, all of it screamed authority. But as Keanu watched, he could also see that it wasn't working on Carlos. Carlos wasn't afraid. There was a quiet strength in the man that Keanu admired. But he couldn't help feeling a growing unease in his own chest. The situation was escalating, and it was hard to tell where it would go. "We're going to have to move you along," Officer Voss insisted, his voice sharp with impatience. He looked at Carlos like a man who had no time for explanations. "I'm not asking." Carlos didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly folded his painting supplies, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this many times. "I've been here long enough to know the rules," he said evenly, "and I'm not breaking them." His eyes never left Voss, a quiet defiance in them. "You can keep pushing, but I'm not going anywhere." Keanu could feel the heat of the moment rising. Voss was not accustomed to being ignored, to being spoken to like this. Keanu's heart began to pound as the tension grew, the situation teetering between confrontation and de-escalation. Officer Lee, sensing the brewing conflict, stepped in again. "Jake, it's not worth it," she said, her voice calm and even. She looked at Voss, her gaze steady. "Let's just move on. He's following the rules." Voss ignored her, his eyes still locked on Carlos. There was a dangerous edge to his expression now, one that told Keanu this was no longer just about the art or the rules. It was about proving a point, about breaking someone down to show that they had no right to stand their ground. Keanu could feel the anger rising within him as he watched. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he intervene? But what could he possibly say or do? He wasn't supposed to be here, after all. Not as Keanu Reeves. He wasn't supposed to be part of this. But the longer he sat there, the more he realized that he couldn't just stay quiet. He couldn't ignore the injustice unfolding right in front of him. Keanu watched in silence, the rising tension between the officers and Carlos palpable in the air. Voss was relentless, and Carlos remained calm. A picture of quiet defiance. The words exchanged between the two were sharp, yet Carlos held his ground, not allowing the officer to push him around. It was clear that Officer Voss was escalating the situation, his authority challenged by Carlos's refusal to back down. Keanu couldn't help but notice how Officer Lee stood back, her eyes darting between Voss and Carlos. She was the only one trying to calm the situation, but it was clear that she wasn't in charge. Voss was determined, and his body language screamed dominance. Every move he made was calculated to assert his control over the situation, to force Carlos into submission. His gaze never wavered from Carlos, eyes narrowed with a sense of superiority. There was a quiet tension in the air now, a palpable discomfort that seemed to hang over them all. Carlos, though, didn't seem bothered. He wasn't backing down. He was prepared to face whatever came next. But Keanu could see how this interaction was eating away at him. He was tired. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. This was his life, this constant back and forth with authority, and it had worn him down in ways Keanu couldn't fully understand. As the exchange continued, Keanu started to realize that this wasn't just about Carlos and the officers. It was about something bigger, something deeper. It was about the constant erosion of dignity that people like Carlos had to endure every day. The streets weren't just physically difficult. They were emotionally exhausting too, and the system that was supposed to protect everyone was, in this case, the very one that was making them invisible, that was treating them like nothing more than a problem to be erased. Voss took a step forward, trying to close the space between them. "You think I'm playing games?" Voss asked, his voice laced with contempt. "I'll move you out of here whether you like it or not." His tone left no room for negotiation. Carlos stood still, his face unreadable. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice unwavering. "You can try all you want, but I'm here legally and I'm staying." Keanu felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that this situation was rapidly reaching a breaking point. Officer Voss was determined to break Carlos's resolve, but there was something in the way Carlos stood that made Keanu admire him. Despite the officer's aggression, despite the constant threats, Carlos remained unmoved. Officer Voss approached with a clear intent, his eyes narrowing as they settled on Carlos's artwork. His posture stiffened, exuding an air of arrogance that made Keanu uneasy. The way Voss scrutinized the paintings made it feel less like a professional inspection and more like an attack. He wasn't interested in the artwork. He was interested in asserting his dominance. "You can't do this," Voss barked, his tone cutting through the quiet morning air. "You're blocking the sidewalk. People need to walk by." Carlos didn't react immediately, his hands still moving with careful precision over his art supplies. Keanu noticed how Carlos's movements were deliberate, unhurried, a stark contrast to Voss's aggressiveness. The homeless artist's calmness seemed to only fuel Voss's frustration. "I'm not blocking anyone," Carlos replied, his voice steady but firm. "I'm within my boundaries. I have the proper permits." Voss didn't even flinch at Carlos's words. "Permit or not, it doesn't matter. You're in the way, and people don't care about your art. They need space to walk." His voice was dripping with condescension. Keanu felt a pang of anger rising in him, though he remained silent. He could see the power struggle unfolding, the way Voss was dismissing Carlos entirely. He wasn't just enforcing the law. He was dehumanizing the man in front of him, reducing him to an obstacle. It was a subtle cruelty, one that Keanu found hard to ignore. Carlos continued to pack his supplies, his demeanor calm, as if he had learned long ago that this kind of interaction was inevitable. But Keanu could see the weight in his actions, the exhaustion of being constantly pushed to the margins, the toll of being ignored and belittled by those who were supposed to protect. "What's it going to take, huh?" Voss pressed, stepping closer, his voice rising. "You think you're special just because you paint? You're not. You're just another homeless person in the way." Carlos met Voss's gaze for a brief moment before looking away and finishing his task. "I'm just doing my thing. I'm not hurting anyone." Voss didn't let Carlos's calm response deter him. He took another step closer, his eyes flashing with impatience. The tension was palpable, hanging heavy in the air. Carlos remained rooted in place, a quiet resistance in the way he carried himself. It wasn't anger that fueled him, it was experience. Years of being pushed around, of watching authority figures take advantage of their power, had made him resilient, but Keanu could see it in his eyes. The exhaustion, the quiet hurt of being treated like an object, invisible to the world around him. "You really don't get it, do you?" Voss sneered, his voice rising. "You're a vagrant. You don't belong here." His words were sharp, each one cutting into the air with a force that was meant to intimidate. Carlos didn't flinch. His face remained calm, but there was a quiet strength in his posture, a defiance that said more than words ever could. "I'm not a vagrant. I'm an artist," he said simply, his voice steady but filled with the weight of truth. Keanu couldn't help but feel a deep sense of injustice as he watched the interaction unfold. Officer Voss was clearly enjoying the power he wielded over Carlos, using his position to tear down someone who had already been broken by life. There was no need for the aggression, no need for the dehumanizing tone. But Voss didn't care. To him, Carlos was just another problem to be swept aside. Carlos finished packing his supplies, his movements deliberate, almost as if he were tuning out the world around him. But Keanu could see the strain, the quiet pain in his eyes. Carlos wasn't just packing up his art. He was packing away a piece of his dignity, trying to avoid confrontation without backing down. As the silence stretched between them, Officer Lee stepped forward. Her presence was a stark contrast to Voss's, and Keanu could sense the tension shift slightly. She didn't speak immediately, just observed the situation with a calm, steady gaze. "Jake," Officer Lee said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let's just walk away. This isn't worth it." Voss looked at her for a long moment before scowling. "He's in violation. We don't have time for this," he snapped, his gaze still fixed on Carlos. Keanu could see the clear difference in approach between the two officers. Officer Lee wasn't trying to assert control through intimidation. She was trying to resolve things with respect, with professionalism. But Voss's aggression was relentless. It was as if he viewed Carlos as less than human, as if he could break him with nothing more than his presence. Keanu felt the weight of it all. This wasn't just an isolated moment. It was part of a much larger, systemic problem. Officer Voss wasn't the exception, he was the rule. The tension between Officer Voss and Carlos was thick, almost suffocating. Voss's face flushed with impatience, his eyes darting between Carlos and Officer Lee, as if searching for a way to reassert control. His stance was aggressive, his hands hovering near his belt, ready to enforce whatever point he felt needed proving. Carlos stood firm, but the air around them seemed to crackle with the growing sense of unease. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling, heading toward something inevitable. Carlos gave a small sigh, his gaze flickering briefly to Officer Lee, then back to Voss. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said quietly, his voice steady, despite the growing tension. "I'm just trying to make a living, the same as anyone else. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not breaking any laws." Officer Voss snorted, his face a mask of disbelief. "You're a homeless artist? You think that gives you special rights? You think you can do whatever you want just because you've got a canvas and a permit? It doesn't work that way." His words were venomous, dripping with disdain. Keanu could see the look in Carlos's eyes as Voss continued. It wasn't just anger. It was a quiet, tired resignation. He had heard these words before, dealt with this kind of condescension too many times to count. It was the same narrative that had been playing out on the streets for years. The homeless being treated as less than human, pushed aside, erased from the world around them. Voss wasn't just challenging Carlos's right to be there, he was challenging his very existence. Carlos remained calm, but Keanu saw the weight in his expression. The years of being pushed around, of being told he didn't matter. It had built up, layer by layer. But even now, Carlos refused to back down. He wasn't just fighting for his space on the sidewalk. He was fighting for his dignity, his humanity. Officer Lee shifted slightly, stepping forward with a more neutral stance. She addressed Voss, her voice measured. "Jake, enough. He's complied. He's not doing anything wrong. Let's just move on." Voss didn't respond immediately. He seemed to hesitate, weighing the options. Keanu felt the shift in the air. This wasn't just about a street corner anymore. This was about something bigger, something more deeply ingrained in the way people were treated based on their status, based on their place in the world. Keanu was starting to understand. He had come here to observe, to learn, to witness the lives of those who lived on the fringes of society. But now, as he watched Officer Voss's relentless pursuit of control, he began to feel something stirring inside him. He couldn't just be an observer anymore. He couldn't sit back and let this continue. Keanu sat quietly on the edge of the planter, watching as the tension unfolded between Officer Voss and Carlos. He felt a mixture of anger and helplessness growing within him as he witnessed the way Voss wielded his authority. It was a harsh reminder of the power imbalance between law enforcement and those who were vulnerable, those who lived on the fringes of society. Keanu knew that he had stepped into a world that many people preferred to ignore, but now, sitting in the middle of it, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the homeless. It was about authority, control, and who got to decide who mattered. As Officer Voss continued his verbal onslaught on Carlos, Keanu's mind raced. He was a witness now, but part of him felt the urgent need to do something more. He wasn't just watching this injustice unfold, he was complicit in it by remaining silent. His thoughts were interrupted as Officer Voss turned his attention to him. Keanu looked up, meeting the officer's gaze. Voss's eyes narrowed as he approached, his movements quick and deliberate. The air between them crackled with tension, and Keanu could feel the officer's aggression directed at him now. There was no room for subtlety with Voss. He wasn't going to just ignore Keanu's presence. He wanted to confront him, challenge him. "Fine." "You?" Officer Voss said sharply, his voice cutting through the air. "What are you doing here? You're with him, aren't you? Helping him break the rules?" Keanu didn't respond immediately. He simply met Voss' gaze, his expression calm, unruffled. There was no need to rise to the bait. He had seen this before, in films and real life. This was the moment where authority sought to assert itself, and Keanu wasn't about to let Voss rattle him. "I'm just helping a friend pack up his artwork," Keanu replied quietly, his voice steady and calm. It was a simple statement, but in the moment it carried a weight that he hadn't fully anticipated. His calmness seemed to agitate Officer Voss even more. Voss stepped closer, his eyes scanning Keanu, as if trying to find some fault in his presence. "No ID? No paperwork? No nothing?" Voss's voice rose with impatience. "What are you really doing here? Don't think you can just hide behind this guy and get away with it?" Keanu didn't flinch. "I told you," he said, his voice unshaken. "I'm just helping." Officer Voss's face flushed with irritation. "You're not even giving me a straight answer," he snapped. "You look like just another one of them, another one who thinks they can get away with anything because they don't have to follow the rules." His words were sharp, laced with disdain. Keanu remained seated, his body relaxed, his posture unthreatening. He could feel the heat of the officer's frustration, but he refused to give in to it. In this moment, it wasn't about power. It wasn't about who could dominate whom. It was about witnessing, about understanding the difference between aggression and authority. Officer Voss stepped even closer, now just inches away from Keanu. The intensity of his gaze was hard to ignore, but Keanu refused to let the officer's aggression unsettle him. He could feel the pressure building, but he held his ground, his posture still relaxed despite the tension. There was a strange sense of power in the stillness, a power that came from simply refusing to be intimidated. "What's your name?" Voss demanded, his voice tight with irritation. He was searching for any way to break Keanu's calm, to rattle him into making a mistake. "You're not even carrying ID? You don't have a permit. What gives you the right to be here?" Keanu didn't flinch. He knew the question wasn't really about him. It was about asserting control, about forcing him to comply, to reveal himself in a way that would make him vulnerable. But Keanu wasn't about to give that up. This moment was about more than just him. It was about the thousands of people like Carlos, like those who lived on the streets, whose voices were silenced, whose identities were stripped away by authority figures like Voss. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Keanu said simply, his voice unwavering. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just helping my friend." Voss's frustration seemed to boil over. "This is exactly the problem," he spat, his words punctuated with the sharpness of someone who felt his power slipping. "People like you think you can do whatever you want without consequences, without respect for the law, for the system." Keanu could feel the weight of those words hanging in the air. They weren't just directed at him. They were directed at everyone, like Carlos, at everyone who had ever been treated as less than human because of their circumstances. The more Voss spoke, the more Keanu realized just how deeply ingrained the abuse of power was. This wasn't just about one officer or one encounter. It was part of a larger system, one that had failed to protect those who needed it most. "I don't need your permission to help," Keanu responded, his voice firm now. "I'm not here to challenge you. I'm just helping." The simplicity of his words seemed to hit Voss like a wall. The officer took a step back, as if surprised by the calmness with which Keanu faced him. He was used to people backing down, used to seeing fear in their eyes. But Keanu wasn't afraid. He wasn't intimidated by Voss's presence. He was simply existing, refusing to let the officer strip away his dignity, just as Carlos had done. Keanu began to understand something in that moment. The officer's anger, his insistence on control, wasn't just about following the rules. It was about creating a hierarchy. It was about maintaining a system where those in power could decide who mattered, who got to have a voice, and who was invisible. Keanu wasn't just witnessing this power struggle, he was beginning to feel the weight of it. The tension between Keanu and Officer Voss felt suffocating. Voss's anger was palpable, but Keanu remained still, unshaken by the officer's intimidation. He had been silent for too long, a mere observer. But now, with every word from Voss, Keanu felt the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that treated people like Carlos as if they didn't matter. Voss' voice grew louder. "You think you can just hide behind this guy? You're nothing like him. You don't belong here." Keanu's voice was calm but firm. "I'm not here to make trouble. I'm just helping." Voss's frustration deepened, his need to assert control more obvious with each passing second. But Keanu's simple, steady response was a silent challenge. It wasn't just about complying with authority. It was about asserting dignity, something that Voss clearly couldn't understand. The officer's gaze flickered briefly to Carlos, then back to Keanu. "I'm done talking. Show me your ID," Voss snapped. He needed Keanu to be the one who broke, to show that the power still rested with him. Keanu didn't flinch. "I'm not here to play games, just helping my friend pack up his things." Keanu realized, as he said those words, the shift inside him. This wasn't just a chance to witness the injustice, he was beginning to feel it too. The world he was observing wasn't just about laws and enforcement. It was about authority, control, and how far the system would go to maintain power over people like Carlos. The more Voss pushed, the clearer it became. Keanu wasn't just witnessing power at play, he was beginning to experience it too. This was bigger than the moment. It was about the truth of what people like Carlos went through daily, how they were constantly erased, ignored, pushed aside. The systemic cruelty wasn't something he could just observe anymore. It was something he was now part of. Keanu remained seated on the curb, his body still, his mind clear. The chaos of the moment seemed distant, almost irrelevant to the quiet space he had found within himself. He had been calm all along, but now, as Officer Voss towered over him, his calmness felt like a steadying force. The officer's aggression only seemed to magnify Keanu's composure. It was like the world had shrunk to just the two of them, Voss's sharp, intimidating energy and Keanu's quiet resistance. Voss's jaw clenched, his frustration building as he towered over Keanu. The words were coming faster now, sharper, like daggers aimed to provoke a response. "I told you to get up," Voss said, his voice louder this time, demanding compliance. "Move away from the area, now!" Keanu didn't flinch. He simply met Voss's eyes, his expression unchanged. He wasn't interested in a power struggle, but he wasn't going to back down either. Voss was trying to break him, to make him submit, but Keanu knew better. This wasn't about obeying an order. It was about Voss asserting control, trying to prove that he had the authority to make others bend to his will. Keanu could feel it now, this subtle shift in the power dynamic. Voss's words became more forceful. "You think you can just sit here and do whatever you want? I'm telling you to move. Get up." Keanu remained silent, his focus unwavering. He wasn't going to engage in the game Voss was playing. The more Voss pushed, the more Keanu felt a sense of inner peace settling over him. He wasn't the one in turmoil. Voss was. Voss was desperate to reassert control, to remind Keanu of the hierarchy, to show that as long as he wore the badge, he had the power. Keanu felt it acutely, the need for dominance, for authority, that didn't allow for questions, for anyone to step out of line. But Keanu didn't step out of line. He simply stayed where he was, grounded in the moment. He knew that the real power was not in force or intimidation, but in the ability to remain calm, to remain centered in the face of aggression. It wasn't about fighting back. It was about refusing to give in, refusing to participate in the struggle that Voss wanted to drag him into. The power dynamic was shifting, slowly but unmistakably. Keanu's presence had become a challenge to Voss's authority, and it was something Voss wasn't prepared for. The officer's words were sharp, but there was a tremor in his voice now, a subtle crack that betrayed his growing uncertainty. Keanu wasn't backing down, and it was unsettling for Voss. Keanu wasn't a homeless man to be pushed around. He was someone who refused to be intimidated. Voss's patience was wearing thin, but Keanu remained unmoved. The officer's words were growing sharper, but Keanu's calmness only seemed to aggravate him more. Voss leaned in closer, his voice growing more forceful. "I told you to move. I'm not asking anymore," he snapped, his face flushed with frustration. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to arrest you." Keanu didn't react to the threat. His eyes met Voss's with quiet resolve. The officer's attempt to intimidate him only made Keanu more certain. Voss was trying to force him into submission, trying to break him with his authority. But Keanu knew that real strength didn't come from dominance. It came from maintaining composure, from choosing to stand firm without retaliation. The silence between them stretched, uncomfortable, thick with the tension of unspoken words. Voss was waiting for Keanu to give in, to react. But Keanu remained still, his posture relaxed, his breath steady. There was nothing in his expression that indicated fear or resistance. He wasn't going to be dragged into a confrontation, not in the way Voss expected. Voss's eyes flickered with disbelief. He couldn't understand why Keanu wasn't reacting. He was used to seeing people back down when confronted with his authority. But Keanu wasn't backing down. Instead, he remained silent, letting the tension hang in the air, letting the officer's aggression speak for itself. "I'm not going to ask you again," Voss growled, his frustration spilling over. "Get up and move, now." Keanu's response was simple, quiet, and unshaken. "I'm not going anywhere." The officer's anger was palpable, but Keanu didn't budge. He knew that by staying calm, he was challenging Voss's entire approach to power. He wasn't backing down because he knew what Voss was trying to do. He was trying to force him into a submission that Keanu wouldn't give. The officer's need for control, his desire to break those around him, was becoming clearer by the second. The power dynamic was shifting. Keanu wasn't just sitting there. He was standing his ground in a way that no one had expected. And Voss, for the first time, felt the unease of not having control. Voss's frustration was becoming palpable, but Keanu remained calm, steady, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the officer's frustration growing, but he refused to feed into it. This wasn't about defiance. It was about choosing not to play into the toxic game of dominance Voss was trying to impose. Keanu wasn't interested in a power struggle. He was simply not going to let Voss control him. "I said, get up," Voss barked again, his face now inches from Keanu's. His voice was tense, desperate for compliance. "You think you can sit here all day and not listen to me? You don't even have an ID." Keanu stayed seated, unmoving. There was nothing in his posture or his expression that suggested fear. The silence between them stretched, growing thicker with each passing moment. The officer's words, sharp and filled with authority, bounced off Keanu like water off a stone. Voss was still trying to break him, trying to get a reaction, but Keanu wouldn't give him one. Voss's anger flared. "You're nothing but a troublemaker. If you don't move, I'll make you move," he threatened, stepping even closer, his words practically dripping with contempt. Keanu remained silent, but now there was a sense of clarity in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for his own space anymore. In this moment, he was experiencing the very same treatment that people like Carlos had endured day after day. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. The way people like Carlos were treated as invisible, as less than human, by those with authority. He could feel it now. The weight of systemic abuse, the power dynamic that had always existed, where those who had the most power were never questioned. But Keanu wasn't going to be just another silent witness. He wasn't going to let Voss's authority go unchallenged. Keanu wasn't here to escalate the situation, but he wasn't going to be broken by it either. His presence, his refusal to back down, was the real challenge to Voss's control. The more Voss pushed, the more Keanu realized that the real power wasn't in forcing compliance. It was in standing firm in the face of aggression, in choosing not to be intimidated. As the officer stood towering over him, his chest rising and falling with frustration, Keanu remained still, calm, an unspoken challenge to the authority trying to dominate him. The air was thick with tension as Officer Lee appeared on the scene. Her calm, measured steps contrasted sharply with Voss's aggression. She approached the situation with a quiet authority, scanning both Keanu and Voss. Keanu, seated on the ground, felt a sense of relief wash over him at the sight of her. She wasn't here to escalate, but to resolve. She assessed the situation quickly, her eyes moving between Voss and Keanu. It was clear that Voss had pushed too far, and Lee immediately recognized that Keanu's compliance wasn't the issue. It was Voss's overreaction that had fueled the escalation. "Jake," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm, "this isn't necessary. He's not resisting. Let's take a step back." Voss was visibly irritated, his shoulders stiffening as he shot a look of disbelief at her. "I'm handling it," he snapped, his voice tense. "He's not complying with my orders." Lee's gaze never wavered. "He's been compliant from the start. There's no reason for this to escalate." Voss narrowed his eyes. "He's wasting my time." Lee didn't let him get away with it. "And you're making this worse." She turned to Keanu, her eyes softening. She could see that he wasn't there to cause trouble. His demeanor showed nothing but patience, something Voss clearly didn't understand. Voss's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being questioned, and certainly not in front of someone who saw right through his actions. "I'm not going to let him sit here all day," he growled. Lee stepped closer to Voss, her tone still even. "You don't have to. Let's move on. There's no need to make this a bigger issue than it already is." Keanu watched, silently appreciative of Officer Lee's intervention. She wasn't trying to prove a point, wasn't trying to dominate the situation. She was focused on resolution, on diffusing the tension without further conflict. For the first time, Keanu felt a glimmer of hope. There was still some humanity left in the system, even if it was rare. Officer Voss's face twisted with frustration, his gaze never leaving Keanu. It was clear he wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a fellow officer. The tension between the two was palpable, and Keanu could feel the weight of it. He understood now that Voss wasn't just angry at him, he was angry at being challenged. His need to assert control, to remind everyone who was in charge, was consuming him. "You don't understand," Voss muttered, his voice low but full of menace. "People like him, they don't deserve the time of day. They're just here to cause problems." Keanu felt a quiet pang of anger at the officer's words. "People like him" was a phrase that stung, and it was clear to him now that Voss saw the homeless as less than human, as obstacles to be cleared away. He was willing to ignore basic decency in order to maintain the illusion of power. Officer Lee didn't flinch. She stepped closer to Voss, her presence both calming and commanding. "Jake, this isn't the way to handle things. He's not doing anything wrong. There's no need for force here. Let's move on." Her tone was soft, but it carried the weight of authority. It was clear she wasn't backing down, even in the face of Voss's anger. Voss looked as if he wanted to argue, to push back against her intervention, but Lee's calmness, her refusal to be intimidated, was something he couldn't quite fight against. She wasn't asking, she was telling him. And something in Voss seemed to recognize that. "I'm just trying to keep things under control," Voss said, his voice slightly softer, but still filled with defensiveness. Lee crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. "Control doesn't mean intimidation. It means knowing when to step back." She turned her attention back to Keanu, offering him a small, understanding nod. "You're fine. Just stay calm." Keanu's heart softened at her words. Officer Lee wasn't just diffusing the situation. She was showing him that not all officers were like Voss. Not all of them used their power to dehumanize. Some still saw the people they were meant to protect as equals, as deserving of respect. It was a quiet, almost invisible form of rebellion against a system that had allowed people like Carlos to suffer. Voss, still unwilling to let go of his frustration, stepped back, but his eyes still burned with anger. Keanu could see that, for him, this was far from over. But Lee's intervention had shifted the balance. Voss had been forced to back down, to let the situation go, even if he didn't want to. The silence that followed Lee's intervention was thick, and the tension in the air seemed to pulse with each passing second. Officer Voss, still standing with his arms crossed, glared at the ground, as if trying to will the situation into submission. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes darted between Officer Lee and Keanu, a clear message in his gaze. This wasn't over, at least not in his mind. Keanu remained seated, his body still, his mind processing everything that had just happened. He had witnessed something important, something that hadn't been part of his plan. Officer Lee had stepped in, not to escalate, not to add to the aggression, but to remind everyone that there was a way forward without intimidation. In that simple act, she had shown Keanu what real authority looked like, not the force that comes from a uniform or a badge, but the quiet strength of standing firm in the face of conflict. Officer Lee gave Voss one last look, and without a word she turned her attention back to Keanu. "You're good," she said, her voice warm and professional. "I'm sorry about the disturbance." Keanu gave her a small nod, a gesture of appreciation. "It's okay," he replied, his voice calm. "I understand." Lee's eyes softened as she observed him for a moment longer. There was something in her expression that suggested she saw more than just a man in disguise. She saw someone who was grappling with the same truths that she was. It wasn't easy to confront the injustices of the world, especially from within the system that perpetuated them, but Keanu sensed that Lee was one of the rare few who hadn't given up on the possibility of change. As Lee began to walk away, Voss remained behind, still fuming, but he knew he was defeated. Keanu could feel the shift. The presence of Officer Lee, calm and reasonable, had made all the difference. She hadn't just diffused the situation. She had shown him that there were people who still understood the importance of humanity, even in a world that often turned a blind eye to the most vulnerable. Keanu sat in the quiet aftermath, his thoughts racing. The power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just an observer anymore, he was part of this. Watching Voss retreat, he knew that he was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation in a way he hadn't before. The world wasn't as black and white as he had once thought. There was a space for hope, for compassion, and for change, even in a system that seemed so broken. As the confrontation with Officer Voss started to die down, Keanu remained seated, his eyes focused ahead, completely unbothered by the chaos around him. The world seemed to slow, the noise fading away as he processed the weight of what had just happened. He had seen the shift, felt the atmosphere in the square change after Officer Lee intervened. It wasn't just a change in the power dynamic between Voss and himself. It was something deeper, something in the air that felt like it had been waiting for the right moment to burst forth. Keanu noticed a figure moving through the crowd, a street photographer with a camera in hand. The photographer was close enough to catch every moment. Keanu's calm, his quiet defiance. There was something raw about the way the camera captured him, the stillness that contrasted so sharply with the tense energy surrounding him. It wasn't just a photograph. It was the beginning of something bigger. As the photographer adjusted his lens, Keanu understood what was happening. The world was about to see him, see his stillness, his refusal to escalate. He wasn't acting out of defiance, he was acting out of respect. For himself, for the people like Carlos, for those who had been rendered invisible. His calmness was a direct challenge to the aggression that had tried to dominate him, and the world would be able to see it now. Before Keanu could even fully grasp the magnitude of the moment, the photographer raised his camera and snapped a shot. Then, with a few swift movements, the photographer pulled out his phone and started live streaming the event. The image of Keanu sitting calmly in the face of authority was now being broadcast to anyone who was willing to watch. It wasn't just one image. It was the truth of the moment, a moment that captured the essence of what Keanu was experiencing and, by extension, what many others in society had been experiencing for far too long. The crowd around Keanu began to grow. People had started to gather, intrigued by the scene, perhaps unsure of what had been going on, but fascinated by the tension that had unfolded. Some stood in silence, while others murmured amongst themselves, unsure of what to make of the situation. But what was clear was the shift in the air, the sense that something had just happened, something important, even if no one could quite put their finger on it. As Keanu remained motionless, the live stream caught his every move, or lack thereof, and it began to spread. People were commenting, sharing, reacting in real time. Some saw Keanu's calm as a defiant stance against authority, while others saw it as a quiet strength in the face of a world that often ignored the most vulnerable. Whatever it was, the stream was gaining traction, and the message was starting to spread. Keanu remained unaware of the growing audience online. He wasn't doing this for anyone but himself, for the experience of standing firm and observing the power dynamics that unfolded around him. Yet, without intending to, he was becoming a symbol of defiance without aggression, a symbol of resistance that didn't require violence or shouting. The live stream was now catching fire, its viewership growing by the second. Keanu's calm resistance had struck a chord with people, and the reaction started flooding in. Viewers from all over were commenting, sharing, and discussing the scene unfolding in real time. The simplicity of the moment, Keanu sitting still, unbothered by the authority before him, was resonating with more people than he could have anticipated. The crowd around Keanu began to grow. Some were drawn by the spectacle, others because they felt something shifting in the air. For the first time, they were seeing someone stand firm without aggression, without needing to yell or fight back. The tension that had initially been driven by confrontation was now transforming into something different. a peaceful yet powerful stand against the intimidation that often came with authority. Keanu remained seated, fully aware that the live stream was broadcasting the moment to thousands, if not more. But his focus wasn't on the growing crowd or the attention he was receiving. He was still processing what was happening, trying to understand the deeper truth unfolding before him. As the crowd swelled and the digital world began to react, Keanu realized that the message was reaching beyond just those present in the square. The tension in the air was palpable as the crowd began to take in what Keanu had done. Some were nodding, others whispering quietly, but all of them were witnessing something that couldn't be ignored. They were seeing the power of simply standing your ground, of holding your dignity, even in the face of overwhelming force. The live stream became a mirror for the world, a reflection of what was happening right in front of them. Keanu wasn't doing this for fame. He wasn't doing it for the crowd. He was doing it because he understood, in that moment, that sometimes visibility was the first step to change. As the live stream continued to spread, Keanu became acutely aware of the ripple effect of his actions. The crowd around him seemed to grow larger, their eyes focused on him, some with curiosity, others with genuine admiration. The silence he maintained became a statement, an unspoken truth that was now being witnessed by thousands, maybe more. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. The tension between Voss and Keanu slowly dissolved as the officer's frustration became more evident. The officer wasn't just mad at Keanu for sitting there. He was mad that Keanu wasn't reacting the way he was supposed to. Voss wanted a fight. He wanted to see submission, to remind everyone who had the power. But Keanu wasn't complying with that script. Instead, he just sat, unbothered, unaffected by the storm of authority swirling around him. As the live stream gained more traction, Keanu noticed the shift in the crowd's energy. They weren't just standing around anymore. They were becoming active participants in this silent stand. Phones were lifted and conversations started to bubble up. The live stream was a lens, and through it, people were starting to see something they hadn't noticed before. The power dynamics that existed, unchallenged, in everyday life. The way people in positions of power could treat those they deemed beneath them, with no consequence. But Keanu's stillness, his refusal to escalate, was shifting that dynamic. He was showing them that resistance didn't always have to be loud. It didn't always have to be violent. Sometimes it was enough to simply stand firm and let the world see what was happening. The more the live stream spread, the more people began to comment, to share, to discuss. The tension that had been so palpable earlier now felt different. It was no longer just about Keanu sitting on the curb. It was about a larger conversation that was happening across social media, across the world. A conversation about power, respect, and the truth of what was happening when people were left unseen. The situation escalated quickly as Officer Voss, frustrated beyond reason, took another step forward, his eyes locked onto Keanu. "I told you to get up," he repeated, his voice now laced with an edge of menace. His posture was rigid, the tension in his body palpable as he loomed over Keanu, who still sat quietly on the curb, unmoved by the officer's threats. Voss was losing control, and Keanu could see it clearly. The more he sat there, the more frustrated Voss became. The officer's need for authority, for compliance, was pushing him to cross a line. The power Voss felt when giving orders was slipping away, and Keanu's calm was serving as a reminder that power could be wielded in ways other than through force and aggression. "Get up now!" Voss snapped again, his tone growing more impatient, more demanding. The crowd around them was still, but their attention was growing more intense. Phones were being raised, capturing every moment of the interaction. The live stream was still running, its viewership swelling as more people joined in to watch the confrontation. Keanu's stillness was the center of attention, and the tension in the air grew thick with each passing second. Keanu felt the weight of the moment. His eyes stayed on Voss, steady and unwavering. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't resisting either, though. He could feel the danger in the air, the thin line between this situation remaining peaceful and it escalating into something much worse. But he was resolute. His silence, his calm, was all he had to offer in the face of what was unfolding. Voss, clearly at the breaking point, took a step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement as he moved into Keanu's personal space. The officer's breath was shallow now, his fists clenched at his sides, the frustration clearly taking hold. He was no longer asking, no longer trying to reason, he was demanding compliance, trying to force Keanu into submission. Keanu felt the heat of the officer's aggression closing in on him, but he remained seated. The power dynamic had shifted, and the crowd, who had been watching silently, was now starting to murmur. Phones were held higher, angles adjusting to capture everything that was happening. Keanu could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of thousands of unseen viewers on the other side of the camera. But even then, he didn't budge. Officer Voss was now so close that Keanu could feel the heat of his breath. The officer's face was flushed with anger, his eyes narrowed in an attempt to exert his dominance. His hands were shaking slightly, not with fear, but with the intensity of his frustration. Keanu, on the other hand, was still. His posture calm, but with an undeniable strength emanating from him. There was no need for words anymore, only the stillness of his presence, which seemed to unsettle Voss more than anything. Sunlight followed Voss over the older of the two. "You're making this difficult," Voss muttered through gritted teeth. "I don't want to make this a bigger problem than it is. Get up, or I'll make you." Keanu's response was simple. He didn't speak, didn't move. His gaze was fixed on Voss, but it was not a challenge. It was a quiet statement. He wasn't going to make this worse than it needed to be. The tension in the air was thick, so thick that it seemed to freeze time for a moment. The crowd around them began to murmur again, a low hum of voices reacting to the scene unfolding in front of them. Keanu could sense the eyes of the crowd, their collective gaze weighing down on him, but he didn't let it affect him. He wasn't doing this for an audience, he was doing this because he knew it was the right thing to do. But Voss wasn't seeing it that way. His face contorted in irritation, his hands now visibly twitching with the desire to act. He was desperate to regain control, to reassert his authority, to make Keanu comply. The power dynamic that had begun to shift earlier was now threatening to snap. Voss's frustration was boiling over, and the situation was teetering on the edge. In a sudden, sharp movement, Voss reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he grabbed Keanu's arm, trying to pull him up. The crowd gasped collectively, some murmuring in disbelief. The action was aggressive, the intent clear. Voss was forcing the issue now, not caring about the potential consequences. Keanu felt the officer's hand on his arm, but he didn't fight back. He didn't resist. His body remained still, his posture calm, but inside he felt the gravity of the moment. He could feel the weight of Voss's hand, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the system that was trying to crush him and so many others like him. Keanu's refusal to react, his ability to remain calm in the face of such aggression, sent a clear message to the crowd. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let the officer dictate how this ended. Voss's grip tightened on Keanu's arm, pulling harder, but Keanu remained motionless, his eyes never leaving the officer's. The tension in the air grew thick, the crowd's murmurs quieting as all attention focused on the scene. Phones were raised, capturing every second, broadcasting the moment to the world. Voss's frustration boiled over, his face reddening with anger, but Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't resist. His calm presence in the face of Voss's aggression was a statement, one that didn't need words. The officer's hand trembled as he struggled to assert his control, but Keanu remained steady, unaffected by the officer's attempts to force him. The crowd sensed the shift. They could see Voss's struggle, his desperate attempt to regain the power he was losing. Keanu wasn't fighting him. He wasn't giving him the reaction he craved. Instead, he was challenging the system silently, with nothing more than his stillness. Voss's movements grew more frantic, but Keanu's composure never wavered. The officer's hand on his arm felt like nothing compared to the weight of the system Keanu was confronting. For a moment, Voss faltered. His control was slipping, and Keanu's quiet defiance was becoming a mirror to the power dynamics at play. The situation had reached its peak. The crowd, the live stream, and Voss's own discomfort had shifted the balance. Keanu wasn't physically resisting, but his presence alone was enough to challenge the authority that Voss represented. The moment of truth had arrived, not with force, but with quiet strength. As the situation reached its boiling point, with Officer Voss still tugging on Keanu's arm and the crowd growing restless, Keanu knew it was time. He had allowed the scene to unfold, his calmness challenging the aggression of authority, but now the moment of truth had arrived. The world had been watching, and it was time for them to see who was really sitting there, defying the system, challenging the power dynamics at play. Keanu took a deep breath, steadying himself, and slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed the cap that had been concealing his identity. As the cap came off, the transformation began to unfold. His hair, usually neatly kept, was now wild and untamed, the disguise slowly falling away to reveal the man behind the mask. The crowd around him gasped, some whispering, others pulling their phones tighter, capturing the shift in real time. Keanu's calm demeanor never faltered. He didn't rush, didn't make any dramatic gestures. Instead, he pulled away the scruffy beard that had been part of his disguise, revealing his familiar face. The recognition was immediate. The disbelief on Officer Voss's face was palpable as he stepped back, his eyes widening in shock. He blinked a few times, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had been so sure. He had been so certain that Keanu was just another homeless man, another problem to be dealt with. But Keanu was no ordinary man, and as his true identity was revealed, the atmosphere shifted entirely. Officer Voss's mind raced, but his mouth couldn't form the words. His entire approach had been to control a situation he had misunderstood completely. Now, confronted with the reality of who Keanu was, he stood frozen, unable to process what was unfolding. The crowd erupted. The realization spread quickly, and people began to react. "It's Keanu Reeves!" someone shouted, and the murmur turned into an uproar. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd, like a wave of realization crashing down on them. The homeless man they had assumed was just another invisible member of society was, in fact, one of the most recognizable figures in Hollywood. And it wasn't just the fact that he was Keanu Reeves. It was the message that came with it. And it wasn't just the fact that he was Keanu Reeves. It was the message that came with it. Keanu wasn't just here to observe, he was here to make a point. As the crowd buzzed with disbelief, Keanu stood there, unmoving, allowing the moment to sink in. The initial shock of his identity being revealed rippled through the onlookers, but Keanu's quiet presence continued to command attention. Officer Voss, still frozen in his tracks, blinked rapidly, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He had been caught completely off guard, and the anger he had been carrying just moments ago was replaced by something more unsettling. Confusion. Officer Lee, on the other hand, stood silently to the side, her gaze fixed on Keanu. It wasn't a look of surprise, but one of understanding. She had seen the truth before the revelation, had sensed there was more to this situation than met the eye. She had quietly observed Keanu's behavior, the way he had carried himself in the face of authority, and now, seeing the truth of his identity, she knew that what was unfolding before her wasn't just a confrontation with a homeless person. It was something much bigger. Keanu's calmness was a direct challenge to the system. By revealing himself as Keanu Reeves, he wasn't just exposing his identity, he was making a statement that transcended personal fame. He was shining a light on the treatment of the homeless, on the systemic abuse that had been allowed to persist without challenge. His identity wasn't the point. It was what his presence represented: the need for accountability, the call for justice. As the footage began to spread across the internet, it became clear that this moment was more than just a viral video. It was a turning point. The reactions from the crowd, from Officer Voss, and from Officer Lee were all captured in real time, and they told a story that could no longer be ignored. People were talking, commenting, sharing, and for the first time, the plight of the homeless, the invisible people that society had overlooked for so long, was at the forefront of a public conversation. Keanu didn't need to say a word. His presence alone spoke volumes. The live stream continued to run, now gaining even more traction as people from around the world tuned in to witness the unfolding story. The tension in the air had shifted from confrontation to revelation. The truth was out there now, and there was no turning back. The footage was now exploding across social media, the numbers skyrocketing as more and more people tuned in to watch the aftermath of Keanu's reveal. Comments flooded in at a rapid pace, and the weight of what was happening became undeniable. The live stream had captured something far more powerful than the clash between Keanu and Officer Voss. It had captured the uncomfortable truth that society often chooses to ignore. The reactions from viewers were mixed. Some were shocked, others were in disbelief, but many understood the deeper message. Keanu's quiet defiance was a powerful form of resistance. His identity, while surprising, was secondary to the real point: his refusal to be a passive observer. By revealing himself, Keanu had sparked a conversation about accountability, about the way the homeless, especially veterans like Carlos, are treated by those in power. Officer Voss's face had gone pale, and his eyes darted around as if looking for a way to undo the situation. He had been so sure of his position, so certain that he was in control, but now the balance of power had shifted. The authority he had so eagerly tried to exert was crumbling, not through physical confrontation, but through the quiet force of Keanu's presence. The system, as Voss had known it, was being exposed in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Officer Lee stood apart from Voss, still processing the revelation, but recognizing the importance of what was happening. The look in her eyes was one of cautious respect, understanding that this moment would change the way they all viewed the homeless and their treatment. Officer Voss, however, seemed lost, unable to process the depth of what had just unfolded. The crowd around Keanu had grown larger, some still standing in stunned silence, others whispering among themselves. It wasn't just the shock of Keanu's identity that had stunned them. It was the realization of the injustice that was so often hidden in plain sight. The moment of truth had arrived, and the world was now watching. The moment the live stream went viral, news outlets around the world began to pick up the story. What had started as a confrontation on a quiet street in Los Angeles had now become a global discussion. Headlines flashed across the screens: Keanu Reeves challenges police authority in public display, and Hollywood star reveals himself as homeless to expose systemic abuse. The world was watching, and opinions were divided. For some, Keanu's actions were nothing short of heroic. They saw his calm resistance as a powerful statement against the mistreatment of the homeless and the systemic abuse of authority. They applauded his willingness to risk his fame and reputation to shed light on a pressing issue. Social media was flooded with support. Hashtags like Keanu Reeves Challenge and See the Invisible trending worldwide. Videos of Keanu sitting calmly in the face of authority were shared millions of times, igniting conversations about empathy, justice, and the responsibility of those in power. But there were also detractors. Critics who viewed Keanu's actions as a stunt, an unnecessary provocation by someone who had the privilege to step out of the situation when it no longer suited him. Some argued that the attention Keanu received overshadowed the very real struggles faced by those who lived on the streets every day. These voices called into question whether his experiment had done more to further his own fame than it had to bring about real change. The fallout wasn't just about public opinion, it was about what came next. Officer Voss, who had been at the center of the confrontation, was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The news broke quickly, further fueling the debate. Some saw this as a victory for Keanu's experiment, a sign that the system was starting to hold its own accountable. Others felt it was a mere reactionary measure, a temporary fix to avoid deeper scrutiny. The officer's leave did not address the systemic issues that had been exposed, issues that stretched far beyond the individual actions of one officer. As the news continued to spread, discussions about police treatment of vulnerable populations gained momentum. Keanu remained in the background, quietly observing the fallout from the sidelines. He knew this wasn't about him. It had never been about him. The attention on his actions was important, but it was the broader message that mattered more. This was about a flawed system, one that had consistently mistreated those who had the least power. Keanu wasn't seeking fame or accolades. He was seeking change. The conversation around Keanu's experiment gained momentum, shifting from viral attention to a serious public debate. News outlets continued to report, with some experts praising Keanu for shedding light on the treatment of homeless individuals, while others criticized him for turning it into a spectacle. Supporters saw Keanu's calm defiance as a powerful statement against the mistreatment of vulnerable people, particularly homeless veterans. The viral footage of Keanu standing his ground became a symbol of resistance against systemic abuse. People shared their own stories of inequality, spurred on by the footage, and many began calling for justice and change. However, the backlash was also loud. Critics argued that Keanu's privilege allowed him to step in and out of homelessness at will, and that his actions overshadowed the real work that had been done by homeless advocates. They questioned the sincerity of his involvement, arguing that it was more about raising his own profile than solving the issue. Despite the mixed reactions, the incident triggered important conversations about authority, empathy, and accountability. Keanu, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. His goal was never fame. It was about challenging a broken system. The officer's temporary suspension didn't address the deeper issues that Keanu knew required sustained attention and real change. Keanu's silence throughout the media frenzy reflected his belief that this moment wasn't about him. It was about exposing the systemic problems that plague society and urging a conversation that needed to happen. As the story continued to spread, it became clear that Keanu's experiment had ignited something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Discussions about police treatment of the homeless were now front and center, with public opinion sharply divided. While some embraced the idea that Keanu's presence was a necessary challenge to authority, others felt it only added to the noise around an issue that was much more complex than a celebrity experiment. Officer Voss's suspension was widely reported, but to Keanu, it wasn't enough. The officer's temporary leave didn't fix the deeper issue, the systemic abuse that had been perpetuated for years. While some saw Voss's suspension as a step in the right direction, Keanu knew that the real challenge lay in dismantling the attitudes that had allowed such mistreatment to go unchecked. Keanu remained mostly silent through it all, watching from the sidelines. He wasn't seeking recognition, but it was clear that his actions had forced a conversation that could no longer be ignored. Media outlets continued to follow the story, with some focusing on the positive impact of his stand, while others criticized him for making it about himself. Yet, no matter the criticism, the fact remained that the conversation about homelessness, justice, and police authority was now alive and well. In the aftermath, the community had begun to respond. Advocacy groups called for more accountability, and some cities started reevaluating their approach to homelessness. The public awareness generated by Keanu's experiment was only the beginning of a larger, more systemic push for change. Keanu understood that real change wouldn't come from a viral moment. It would take time. He had never expected his actions to instantly fix everything, but he knew they had opened a door. Now, it was up to everyone else to step through it. As the whirlwind of attention from his actions began to settle, Keanu found himself in a quiet space, alone with his thoughts. The echoes of the confrontation, the reactions from the crowd, and the aftermath still lingered in his mind. He had never anticipated the magnitude of the impact his decision would have, but now, as the world moved on to the next big story, Keanu reflected on what had truly been accomplished. He could see the conversation unfolding everywhere, from social media platforms to news reports, from community discussions to policy changes. The world was talking about the homeless, about the systemic abuses they faced, and the disparities in power between those who were seen and those who were invisible. But as much as the viral moment had brought attention, Keanu knew that true change didn't happen in a moment. It happened over time, through sustained effort and accountability. Keanu thought back to the moment when he had decided to take action. It hadn't been for fame or recognition, it had been a response to something deeper, something in his soul telling him that he couldn't just stand by anymore. He could have stayed in his comfortable life, enjoying the privileges that came with his fame, but he knew that wouldn't have been enough. Watching people like Carlos, seeing their lives ignored by a system that was supposed to protect them, was a reality that Keanu couldn't ignore any longer. The idea of using his fame as a way to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced seemed like the only way to give them the attention they deserved. It wasn't about him. It was about the bigger picture, the injustice, the neglect, and the cruelty faced by so many. But now, with the story out there, with the attention he had garnered, Keanu realized that this was just the beginning. The real work was in the follow-through, the consistent and continuous effort required to create lasting change. As the days passed, Keanu spent more time in reflection. He knew that while the viral moment had sparked a necessary conversation, it wasn't enough to change a broken system. The public's reaction had been intense, but the real work would be in the long, grueling process of creating tangible change. He couldn't be content with just a moment of clarity. It had to be a movement, one that was sustained by ongoing effort and accountability. Keanu had always believed in the power of storytelling, but he had come to realize that it wasn't just about telling the story, it was about living the change. The incident had opened people's eyes to the struggles of the homeless and the systemic abuse they faced, but now it was up to the public, the officials, and the communities to take that awareness and turn it into action. Keanu was just one voice in the crowd, but he knew the responsibility that came with being heard. He couldn't pretend that his involvement in this fight was over. He had started something, but it was up to others to keep it going. He thought of Carlos, the homeless veteran who had shared his art and his story with Keanu. In Carlos's quiet demeanor, Keanu had witnessed the resilience of those who had been abandoned by society. It had been a humbling experience, one that made Keanu realize how much more he needed to learn about the struggles people like Carlos faced every day. Keanu had merely scratched the surface by sitting on the streets for a day. The reality of homelessness was complex, and he now understood that his role in this wasn't to be a fleeting presence, but a part of something far larger. This was bigger than him. It always had been. The experiment was never just about showing what was wrong with the system. It was about what everyone could do once they had seen the truth. The change Keanu wanted to see couldn't come from one act of defiance or one viral moment. It would come from continued pressure, from individuals and communities pushing for policy changes, from a system that had to evolve or risk losing its credibility. Keanu knew the work ahead was far from over. The attention his actions had garnered was a necessary step, but he understood that lasting change required more than just a viral moment. It would take consistent effort, patience, and ongoing pressure from individuals and communities to push for the systemic change that was needed. Keanu realized that the real impact came from continuing to show up, from amplifying the voices of those who had been invisible for too long. It wasn't enough for him to have a moment of clarity. He needed to focus on the bigger picture, empowering the marginalized and ensuring their voices were heard. The public's reaction had been divided, but that was to be expected. Keanu was not interested in fame or accolades. He wanted change, and he knew that could only come when the public, the government, and law enforcement began to truly listen. His role wasn't to lead the charge, but to encourage others to join in, to keep the conversation alive, and to never let it fade. Looking back at his own actions, Keanu realized the responsibility he now carried. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been ignored or mistreated. His actions had sparked the conversation, but the long-term effort had to come from those who lived these realities every day. Keanu knew that this moment was just the beginning. The true fight for justice would require persistence, but he was ready for it. This was no longer just about one man's actions. It was about a shift in how society viewed power, authority, and human dignity. The public forum was held in a small community center in downtown Los Angeles. The space was filled with a mix of city officials, local activists, concerned citizens, and, of course, the homeless individuals who had been directly impacted by the systemic abuse that had been brought to light. Keanu walked into the room quietly, blending in with the crowd. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. This was not his moment to speak, but rather to listen. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was different from the tension of the street confrontation. This was a gathering of minds, a place where the conversation could move from anger and frustration to real, actionable change. Keanu took his seat among the community members, near a few familiar faces, like Carlos, the homeless veteran whose artwork had first sparked the chain of events. Keanu sat with them, his presence grounding the room. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to be the focus. The people around him were the ones with the real stories, the ones who had lived through the systemic abuse every day. The meeting began with a few opening remarks from the city's representatives. They acknowledged the incident, expressed regret, and promised an investigation. But Keanu could feel that the words were empty to the people in the room. These were the same words that had been spoken for years, with little to show in terms of meaningful change. It wasn't until community members began sharing their experiences that the true weight of the issue began to emerge. A woman named Margaret, who had been homeless for over 10 years, stood up and shared her story. She spoke about the constant fear of being moved from one street corner to the next, the indignity of being treated as invisible, and the pain of losing her sense of self-worth. As she spoke, Keanu couldn't help but feel the heaviness of her words. The room fell silent, all eyes on her as she recounted the abuse she had suffered at the hands of those who were meant to protect her. Margaret's story hung in the air, heavy with pain and frustration. Thomas, a former Marine who had spent years on the streets, followed. His voice was steady but filled with resolve. "We served our country, but now we're treated like we don't matter," he said. "We're not asking for charity, we're asking for respect." His words hit the room like a punch. He spoke about being arrested for simply existing in public spaces, for losing dignity day after day. Keanu listened, his heart heavy with the realization that these were the voices that needed to be heard. Officer Lee, standing quietly in the back, finally spoke. "I've seen what happens when empathy is stripped away," she said. "As an officer, I've watched my colleagues treat people as problems, not as people." Her voice was firm with a newfound conviction, acknowledging the systemic abuse. She recognized that reform was not just necessary, it was urgent. The crowd responded, some nodding, others still unsure. Officer Lee's words, however, sparked a quiet hope. There were still those within the system who understood. She ended by saying, "We need to do better for those suffering now and for the future." The room was silent after Officer Lee's words, the weight of her acknowledgement hanging in the air. Keanu sat still, his presence almost unnoticed now among the people who had come to share their experiences. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the community that had gathered, their stories, and their desire for change. Sarah, a woman who had been homeless for over 10 years, stood up. Her voice shook at first, but the steadiness of her words soon filled the room. "You think you're invisible until you're made to feel like you don't even exist," she said, her voice catching as she looked at the people around her. "You lose everything, your home, your sense of safety, your identity. But the worst part is when you're treated like you're nothing." There was a collective sigh as Sarah's words resonated deeply with everyone present. The truth in her voice was undeniable. This wasn't just about losing a home or possessions. It was about losing one's humanity in the eyes of others. Keanu felt the emotional depth of her statement, his heart heavy with the reality that so many people faced this treatment every day. This was the reality he had set out to expose, and now it was unfolding before him. The conversation shifted from personal pain to potential solutions. The room began to buzz with ideas, but not just any ideas. There was a genuine hunger for systemic change. It wasn't just about providing shelters or services, it was about changing the societal mindset toward the homeless. People wanted to be seen as individuals, not statistics or problems to be solved. They wanted dignity. They wanted respect, and they wanted the chance to rebuild their lives with a sense of worth. Keanu stayed silent throughout, but his heart swelled with a quiet pride. This was the shift he had hoped for, a shift from recognition of the problem to a tangible movement toward justice. He was a catalyst, but now it was the voices of the community that were driving the conversation forward. It wasn't about him being the focus. It was about everyone in that room working together for something larger than themselves. Keanu knew the road ahead would be long. The conversation was just the beginning. But it was a beginning that was full of hope, full of promise, and for the first time in a long while, the path toward change seemed possible. In the weeks following the public forum, Los Angeles began to take small but significant steps toward change. The city officials, while initially slow to respond, were now actively engaged in discussions about the homeless crisis and the systemic issues that had been brought to light. New initiatives were introduced, some small and others more substantial, but all aimed at creating a more compassionate system. One of the first steps was a revamping of police training programs, focused specifically on de-escalation techniques, empathy, and the need for better engagement with vulnerable populations. Officers were trained to recognize the humanity in those they interacted with, particularly the homeless. It was a subtle shift, but one that began to show results in how people were treated on the streets. The changes weren't overnight, but the new approach had begun to make a difference. Meanwhile, the city announced increased resources for homeless individuals. New shelters were opened, mental health services were expanded, and programs designed to help homeless veterans were made more accessible. The focus was shifting from simply managing homelessness to actually solving the underlying issues that contributed to it. More resources were being funneled into community engagement programs, where formerly homeless individuals could help guide the creation of policies that directly impacted their lives. Keanu remained quietly supportive in the background. He wasn't there to take credit, and he wasn't looking for recognition. His role had always been that of a catalyst, a spark that ignited a much larger fire of change. He checked in periodically, making sure that the conversation continued and that the initiatives were being carried out as promised. His involvement had never been about him personally. It was always about lifting up the voices of those who had been ignored for too long. Keanu had hoped that his experiment would lead to something lasting, but even he was amazed at how quickly the city had begun to change. The progress wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long while, Keanu could feel the city beginning to shift in a direction of greater compassion and understanding. As the weeks passed, Keanu's quiet support continued to make an impact, though he remained largely behind the scenes. His focus was always on the larger picture, on ensuring that the shift in policy wasn't just temporary, but part of a long-term effort. The changes were small at first, new shelters opening, a few more outreach programs for the homeless, but they were steady, and they signaled a real desire for systemic change. One of the most significant developments was the creation of community-led task forces to address homelessness in the city. These groups, made up of both officials and homeless individuals, were tasked with creating real, actionable solutions that focused on long-term care and rehabilitation, rather than simply managing the crisis. The voices of the homeless were being listened to in a way they never had been before. The city was no longer just imposing solutions from the top down, but working alongside those who understood the issues most intimately. Keanu knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but he saw a sense of hope beginning to take root. The stories of individuals like Carlos, who had lived on the streets for years, were now being heard in a way they never had been before. Carlos himself had started working as a mentor, helping others who had found themselves in the same circumstances. He had become a key figure in the community, speaking at forums and working with the task forces to ensure that the changes being made were genuinely beneficial. Though Keanu stayed in the background, it was clear that his actions had opened the door to this shift. He had set the stage, but it was the people who had been living these struggles that were driving the change. They were the ones telling their stories, shaping policies, and leading the charge for justice. Keanu watched, knowing that the city was beginning to understand. The work wasn't done, and the problems were far from solved, but he could feel the momentum building. The real challenge would be keeping the conversation alive and pushing for deeper changes. But for now, there was something more powerful in the air than there had been before. A sense of possibility. The weeks that followed continued to build on the momentum Keanu had sparked. The media coverage gradually shifted from sensational headlines about Keanu's actions to more focused discussions about the systemic issues at hand. Public opinion was evolving, and though there were still detractors, it was clear that the conversation around homelessness had changed for the better. Keanu, still mostly silent in the public eye, kept in contact with the people who had been most affected by the changes. Carlos, the homeless veteran whose art had been the starting point of everything, was thriving in ways he never imagined. He had been offered a small studio space by a local organization, and his work was starting to gain recognition. Carlos spoke at community forums, telling his story, and became an advocate for those still living on the streets. His story was a testament to the transformative power of being seen, and Keanu was proud to have been part of that shift. It was during these moments that Keanu felt a quiet satisfaction, not from recognition, but from knowing that he had played a small role in making this happen. The real change, however, was being driven by the community, by the people who had spent years living in the margins. They were now the ones shaping the future. Their voices had always been there, but now they were being amplified in a way that mattered. While Keanu remained out of the spotlight, his role as a catalyst for this change was becoming clearer. He had given people the platform to speak up, to be heard. The city had taken steps to address homelessness more seriously, but Keanu knew that the fight for justice wasn't over. It would take time, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to hold those in power accountable. The real work was just beginning. Keanu understood that. But he also understood that the seeds had been planted, and with enough care, those seeds would grow into something that could, eventually, change not just the city, but the entire system. As Keanu stood in the quiet aftermath of it all, he took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He thought back to the day he made the decision to disguise himself as a homeless man, to step into a world he had never truly understood. The road had been long, and the challenges had been far greater than he had anticipated, but the journey had been worth it. The world had begun to shift in ways that could lead to real change, change that, for once, felt possible. The viral moment had come and gone, but the real work was just beginning. Keanu knew this. His actions, though impactful, were only the beginning of what needed to be done. He had witnessed firsthand the systemic issues that had been ignored for far too long, and now those issues were no longer invisible. But the true battle, Keanu realized, was in sustaining the momentum. It would take the collective efforts of individuals, communities, and officials to continue pushing for real change. Keanu's involvement wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about amplifying voices that had been silenced, bringing attention to a long-standing issue that had been overlooked. The fight for justice was never meant to be a quick fix. It was a journey, one that required time, persistence, and unwavering commitment. As he reflected on the progress that had been made, the new policies, the conversations that were happening in the community, the resources now available for those who had been forgotten, Keanu felt a quiet sense of hope. The shift was tangible. Change was possible. But it was only possible because people had decided to take action. The ones who had lived this reality, the ones who had been ignored, were now leading the charge. Keanu knew his part had been to set the stage. The work ahead, though, belonged to everyone. The future depended on how long people would stay engaged, how much they were willing to fight for justice, and how they would continue challenging the system. Keanu's thoughts began to focus on the next steps, the road ahead. He knew that while progress had been made, it wasn't enough. The true test would be in the follow-through, the perseverance of everyone involved in this movement. There was always a tendency for attention to fade, for the buzz of a viral moment to die down, but Keanu was determined to ensure that the conversation continued. He was just one person, one voice, but the voices of the community, of those who had been directly affected, were the ones that had the power to bring lasting change. This was never about him. It was about the larger cause, about ensuring that people who had been treated as invisible for so long were finally seen, finally heard. Keanu had been fortunate enough to have a platform, but the real heroes were those who had lived through these struggles every single day. They were the ones whose voices needed to rise. Keanu thought of the men and women he had met during this journey. He thought of Carlos, who had gone from painting on the streets to advocating for the homeless. He thought of Margaret, Thomas, and the countless others who had opened up their lives to him. Their stories had changed him. Their resilience had inspired him, and they had reminded him of something important: that the fight for justice was never a one-time event. It was a continuous, tireless battle, and it required more than just moments of clarity. It required a long-term commitment to understanding, to advocating, and to standing up when the system failed. Keanu was no longer just an observer. He was part of something bigger now. He was part of a movement toward justice, toward humanity, and toward dignity for all. And even though he couldn't predict where this journey would take him next, he knew one thing: the fight was far from over. As Keanu stood, reflecting on the changes and challenges ahead, he knew that the work had to continue long after the cameras had stopped rolling. The momentum had been started, but it wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the problem. Real change would require action, day in and day out. Keanu felt a deep sense of responsibility to keep the conversation alive and to ensure that the progress made was not forgotten. The road to true justice was always long, but it was worth every step. He looked around at the community members who had been part of this journey. They were the ones who would carry the torch long after he had moved on to other projects. He was proud to have played his part, but he understood that lasting change would come from the collective efforts of many, from people who were willing to do more than just talk about the problem, but work to solve it. Keanu turned to face the camera, his message simple but powerful. Change is never easy, but it starts with us. It starts with seeing each other, with understanding the struggles that people face and doing something about it. We can't afford to stay silent. We can't afford to turn a blind eye to the injustices in our communities. The fight for justice is ongoing, but together we can make a difference. He paused for a moment, his gaze firm and steady. I encourage you all to stay informed, stay active, and continue challenging the injustices you see. We all have a role to play in creating a more just world. So, don't let this be just another viral moment. Let it be the beginning of something bigger. Keanu's words echoed in the room, a call to action that wasn't just for the moment, but for the future. He knew that the fight wasn't over, but in that moment, he also knew that they had taken the first step towards something truly meaningful, and that was enough to keep moving forward.